Simon Allford is the founding director of Allford Hall Monaghan Morris in London. He leads a studio of 200 architects working around the globe on the design and construction of projects that reflect his belief that outstanding architecture must last through time and accommodate different uses to those that called it into being, while offering an extraordinary and delightful backdrop to the theater of everyday life. Simon is a former chair of the Architecture Foundation and will assume the presidency of the Royal Institute of British Architects from September 1, 2021. Well, thank you for joining here on this Global SuperCast. Simon Allford is joining us from London today, and we're excited to hear his responses to some of these salient questions. Simon, thanks for coming and being with us.
Dave, it's a pleasure to be here and to have the conversation and actually to kind of exchange ideas.
So our first question that we have been talking about is, what are the lessons that you observed through this period of time? I mean, it's been a wild pandemic through this, and there are things we hope that we observed some lessons and we adopted some of those lessons into ourselves. And I'm thinking here at the practice level, but also what you might see is happening societally in lessons learned.
Well, let's start with the bigger picture of society. What I think came up and came clear to a number of people, and quite a large number of people, is how fast the world moves. And the strangeness of the lockdown did actually release some time for reflection. You know, time to think. There's a great quote from the First World War: "Gentlemen, we have no money, now we have to think." And you know, we've had no time, and then suddenly we got this. You know, I think all of us in the modern world are swept up by communication, which on one level is wonderful and an asset, and on another level it overwhelms us with excess data. And I think there was a marvelous sort of pause. It was almost like the world froze for a few days or maybe a few weeks, whilst new systems got put in place. And so I think there was a tremendous kind of realization of the benefit of time to reflect and do things differently. From that came a desire, certainly for me and others I talked to take the best of the worst back into the new future that we're hopefully now entering as lockdown ends. The other thing I think that it highlighted to me during an extraordinarily traumatic year globally in terms of events around the world, in particular, in Minneapolis, and what happened there. There was an outpouring of rage globally. I think that was also linked into the fact that everyone was being confined. And I think it was also linked into the fact that all communication became through social media. And I think social media is an angry place. Even sane people become angry in social media. And it kind of almost brings out the aggression in people. So my big headings are the value of time to reflect, but also awareness of intolerance of views that are different to yours. And I think those are the two things that one, I think, is a potentially liberating force to take into the future. And intolerance is a force that really concerns me now. People are almost frightened to speak and communicate, and what I would regard as a healthy freedom of speech, not an anarchic destruction of society, but a healthy freedom of speech is now almost closed down by angry space in social media world and Twitter, and then that coming into the bigger world of media and newspapers. So there's a really good, and I think a potentially really, really damaging for society, because if society is going to move forward, it needs to discuss and repair, not call out and shout down. And and I think these are two competing, a great benefit and a great danger.
This reminds me, you and I had spoken about this earlier. I had referred to you to a book called Mere Civility. And I'm also reading, I've just finished a book by Dr. Forney at Johns Hopkins, where he writes about civility. And my sense is that we have somehow become decoupled from functional civility and being able to treat each other with a common respect. That doesn't mean that we don't agree with each other. Of course, we will always disagree. We're human beings. But there is a protocol to disagreement that goes from civil to, sadly, uncivil. And we've gotten to this place where, because we hide behind the unanimity of social media, or sometimes we're not even hidden behind it, for some reason we have unplugged this idea of politeness, of civility, of the ability to harshly disagree without hurting one another in a overt way. And as this is just is replete across societies, it has a debilitary effect on how populations will act into the future. And our great hope is that maybe this pendulum swing that's out here will find a counter and come back in and maybe find a moderation in the days to come. Again, that's our hope where we are, but you have nailed it right on the head, where this pandemic has exacerbated this dynamic. And the question is can we get all of this back in the bottle or not?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm an architect, so I'm an optimist. You have to be.
Yeah.
I like to think what we've seen, is the unleashing of certain angers, then exacerbated by the media through which they're expressed, which with the anger released, hopefully what we'll now get is a much more, our responsibility in society, all of us, is to talk. To the anger's unleashed, the sort of the problems, the systemic problems, or historical problems. People now need to talk about, okay, how do we move on and build a more civilized society? Because the danger is, with all the anger, we actually build a divided society. How do we now reconnect society, learn lessons from long history and recent history, and start saying, actually, it's our generation, all of us, living, working, teaching, studying now, to start rebuilding bridges and realize that you can have differences of opinions. And in fact, that's incredibly healthy. It's a bit like, religious tolerance. We didn't have religious tolerance in the medieval, period. It's the idea that actually tolerance and respect of views, then you find common ground. The great thing is you then find common ground, between left and right, one religion and another, one culture and another. And of course, the world is a very large and complex and connected, organism of peoples and philosophies and ideas. And I love that richness. And you don't want to lose that richness of food, of culture, of art, of lifestyle, of sport, whatever it might be. But what you've got to do is then create a place where there are conversations about the common ground that also enjoy and celebrate difference. That's a great thing, difference.
It truly is. One of the other things that we observed on this side of the pond, looking over toward you, was the fantastic commitment of the healthcare community within the United Kingdom, and the NHS strode into their role, and it was extraordinary.
Extraordinary, and I think I think it shifted the political landscape somewhat in terms of the role of government in supporting all people and also of course the NHS is a is a huge organization and very, very, very multinational and diverse. And of course, a lot of the key workers were from all over the world, or from very different, backgrounds. And therefore there was a sort of commonality that great force of different peoples were working together, and they were working for all of us. And I think that's a good example of the idea of common ground.
Yes.
And people celebrating that and suddenly realizing what binds us together is stronger than what divides us. But it's just making sure one justifies that to people in one's actions, whether that's making education more accessible, whether that's making healthcare more accessible, whether it's breaking down barriers in society. And I think the idea of the greater good was, as you said, was exemplified by that. And that's a really good thing that's come out of
Yeah. And it was lovely to not see Brexit dominating everything for that period of time, albeit it continued to operate.
I must just add, I was amused because you'll have heard it was called Project Fear when there was a vote when the world was going to end. I remember this country and Europe before the EU existed. I remember when we weren't in it. I remember when it was called the EEC. And the wonderful thing about the tragic pandemic was the supposed disaster that was Brexit. Just technically, forget where you stood on it. The world continues to spin on its axis, sometimes despite politics and red tape. The human endeavor to get round hurdles is quite remarkable. And Brexit, it happened. The problem was nothing compared to the problem we all faced. You couldn't go out. People were stockpiling food. You couldn't go to your office, and you were now all communicating by Teams. I mean, the idea that we might have a brief shortage of toilet paper, didn't seem particularly debilitating in the context of the pandemic.
Yes, oftentimes, let's not squander a crisis to find a righting of ourselves, right, at the end of the day. So as we think about the future, though, now we find that in this 21st century that events happen quickly and they quickly go to the rearview mirror of us because there's so many more things happening. The question will be what are the permanent changes we think are going to occur? I'm going to ask you to put on your prophetic hat and to speak into the future, but what does the future hold from a permanent change coming out of this pandemic period, both certainly to our industry, the built environment, but again, societally? What are your observations?
Let's start with the built environment this time. Let's go to our smaller but pretty large world. Certainly what happened in the UK, and I believe around the world, is this the awareness of the vulnerability of humankind was really put into context, because when we shut down, there was real fear that this might be a mass slaughter, and it was not on the scale of a bubonic plague, but so far it's seen millions of people around the world die in tragic and often very difficult circumstances. So I think in that, what it highlighted was that vulnerability, and then that actually played well to the awareness of the climate crisis, I believe, so that suddenly it's almost, you're doubly aware. I think we've overplayed doom and gloom in the climate crisis to make it so overwhelming to try and activate a reaction that it almost becomes, well, I can't do anything anyway, and that's the danger of that. Then the pandemic came along and highlighted, actually, we're vulnerable. We're just a small, brief period of time in the history of the world, and therefore, certainly in the UK, climate crisis and climate action in the construction industry has accelerated. It was there, and it was there at an ever increasing awareness and intensity, but suddenly net zero carbon in embodied and operational energy is a very near target. And actually, the wonderful thing, it sounds strange, but it's a fantastic opportunity. It's tragic circumstances, but it's a fantastic opportunity. We are now challenged. Of course, art, architecture, aesthetics matter, but there's a fundamental challenge that's quite liberating in a way. And again, bringing clients, consultants, collaborators, regulators together to try and actually do things at incredible speed. So I think, Charles Eames said, without problems, there's no design. We've got a huge problem. And now there is a lot of design, but it's a refreshing kind of design. The aesthetic program, of course, exists. The art of architecture matters. But now we're analyzing it to an idea about what do we make? How do we make? Who makes? What are their circumstances? How do we transport? We can't build buildings without some idea of offset. What does an offset mean for land restoration, reclamation, flora, fauna, nature? So there's this kind of, and then I bemoaned an excess of data, but now we need to be building and sharing data globally on what we're doing in terms of best practice. And we need to learn from what we've built and feed it back into the loop and admit where we've got it wrong, because then we can really kind of, in that common ground, we share that common information, we can move forward and make really rapid steps. So I'm kind of energized and excited, but obviously facing, a wipeout that we need to deal with. But I'm a great believer, in our ability to adapt.
I will tell you that your response about sharing data is near and dear to our heart at DesignIntelligence. The question is going to be, will we follow the example of the biomedical biotech industry that openly, with a new posture, shared their data with each other, which accelerated the development of these vaccines in just unbelievable amount of time? That would not have happened had there not been this open sourcing of research data with one another to accelerate many of the outcomes that we've seen. And so the question is in the future, will the architects, the engineers, the constructors, the building product manufacturers, will they begin to openly share their data to a place that we all rise on the same tide in a positive way, and not see their data as the competitive advantage? The competitive advantage is the understanding of what comes out of the data, not the data itself. And so I think it's so critical that we enter this new context with a new awareness of what authentic collaboration means, as opposed to this kind of false sense of competition. And I'm hoping that that's the pivot that we're making.
I think you're right. I think your analysis of data, it's how you take that data and use it, intelligently, or with, as you might say, design intelligence. So sharing of data shouldn't be an issue, actually.
Shouldn't.
I mean, I also have a sort of belief in spirit and generosity. If you're generous with your knowledge and ideas, actually, it shows a confidence and your ability to keep pushing yourself. Whatever we're doing now, we need to be doing it better in a year's time, and ever better. And it's not just data, that it's the desire to improve and do things better and to learn from our experience. Otherwise, what is the point? So that, empirical kind of, design by iteration is really crucial. I am seeing evidence everywhere globally of a desire to share data. And, best practice is best practice, and will keep evolving. And, all of us, we compete for work. But, that is more about how we as individuals creatively respond to the data we've got, not having data at all. And in fact, cross-disciplinary data and this opening up, it's also a sign of a confident industry. Not a dying industry, but I believe that the built environment is incredibly crucial to health and social well-being, as well as just life's pleasure. A park, a place, a square, the public spaces in cities and in other areas that we've all had to intensely use. So I think we've been reminded of our shared responsibility, and I believe that that we've got a pre-COP26 summit that we're hosting at the RIBA with Architects Declare, and the idea is to have a global call to share best practice, less declaring and more about action.
More acting. That's absolutely right. Now, spinning out of this space of the built environment, when you look across a larger context of geopolitics, economics, society, communities, what are we seeing as potential permanent changes in those spheres of influence?
I mean, there's a sort of potentially a new, for those of us, a new Cold War emerging. But, China, open as it might appear to be, and Russia, I do think there's a new kind of Cold War. In the global terms, which have often been about military zones and defense, there's a new, cognizance that cyber attack and media attack and distortion obviously that's been much discussed in America, in recent elections, that there's a new kind of arms race. And it's not necessarily the arms race, of nuclear arms, although that's, still a big issue. So I think there's that kind of shift. There's also another shift, which I think is to do with, the global South, all the issues that we're dealing with, and a continent as large as Africa with its population, how a continent like that is going to respond, and hopefully it will jump through all the mistakes we've made, in the way we've, sometimes damaged our environment, and be able to build its own culture of construction and the reinvention of its landscape to cope with a growing population. So I think where the challenges are will shift, and there is this obviously also, I think again globally, this kind of tension between long established ideas of nations and local interest. And you're a federal country, but I think that tension, Brexit is a European version of that. We have our own devolution, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England rather than Great Britain. So I think that there's another kind of, the pulling between the local and the central that again is global. So those are the sort of trends as I see them.
Yeah, and spot on. At DesignIntelligence, we hold that equity, healthiness, and the environment are like a threefold chain that's inextricably linked together. And yet I see in the built environment and in the practice of architecture, so often we pick one of those to focus on. We'll design for sustainable green outcomes, or we'll focus on health and safety. Sadly, we have, as a profession around the world, been mostly neglectful of social equity in our design in an overt way, right? I think it's kind of an after the fact hopeful way, but not overtly. How do we, Simon, begin to adopt this mindset of equity, healthiness, and the environment as focus in all of our design on an ongoing basis?
I think the healthy, the sustainable are kind of increasingly measured and addressed, not adequately enough, but there's a huge amount of work going on in terms of practice and data and action. Equity is an altogether bigger challenge because we work for our patrons, our clients who pay us. They work for their funding regimes, whether they're social or private. They're working some kind of funding model. There is, to me, the way we can best address that, because also we are all working in different political contexts as governments change, but also as we work in different continents, there are different political contexts as well as physical contexts. And I think the way we can, or the way I like to think about it, is that we are building for the long term. And you try and channel the carbon story. You can't build buildings you expect to be, I think, be dismantled. You should expect buildings to remain. So we talk about theatre, stage, set, and props. The theatre is the long life, the frame of the building. It sets the building up, and it's the first to go up and the last to come down. The stage sets and props are what I call the theatre of everyday life, the occupation over shorter regimes of weeks or days or months or clusters of a few years. And actually, that, if you think about I think Buckminster Fuller referred to Spaceship Earth, a place of limited resources. Then if we start thinking about limited resources and the appropriate husbandry of resources, we are beginning to design for those future generations. Not just our clients are no longer just our clients, who of course are our clients legally and financially, but those clients are also aware of long-term values. And the point it's most difficult at is when a client has no stake in the future of their project. So if a client is constructing to sell, they're constructing for a brief moment in time. If a client is constructing with a longer term engagement of the life of the building, then they can think long term. And therefore, ideas about change of use and function and the changing nature of place and city and occupation, an office could ultimately become a collection of apartments and places to work and learn. And if you start thinking that way creatively, this kind of maps back to healthiness, it maps back to low carbon design, but it becomes, I think, an equitable design for, as I always say, the users that we'll never meet, long into the future. Those are the people we're designing for. And also the people who will never even enter our buildings, but who are affected by them in terms of carbon and the environment, but also in terms of the pleasure of walking past an enhanced public realm, past a building which offers a face to the city, that offers some level of engagement and delight. That's the sort of the potential of these things coming together in what could be, if we work hard enough, not just us, society, could become a kind of virtuous triumvirate of forces. But it requires a huge amount of work, and none of us can do it alone. Clients, consultants, contractors, and the community need to be engaged in this process.
So it is a broader conversation needs to be generated around this, and that conversation needs to result in a new, I'll call it social governance, not a governance, but a social governance around the vision that you just laid out, which is not to be designing for the moment, but designing for the generations to come. And that whole idea of adaptability and reuse and change, all within the context, of course, of a sustainable, healthy space that can allow buildings to become these extraordinary places where people can come and go and have full access, and there is a new level of cohesion.
That's right. And there is a spirit. We talk about public rooms in all the buildings we do, whatever they might be. The ground floor to me belongs to the city or the town or the street. And that even the decline of retail, which we've certainly experienced in the UK because of the movement to online and Amazon, etc. But the decline in retail is a new opportunity. You're not going to reinvent retail to fill up that space. It's a new opportunity to create a new activated public realm at ground floor, which can be, currently we might talk about incubators and hubs and subsidized workspaces for new kinds of businesses, from tech to makers, to creatives, to educational bodies. So I think, again, that problem of the decline of retail is such a big problem that we're all having to think much more generously and broadly about how to reactivate the street. So again, I think that's exciting. One was tired of an endless battle with retail agents who just want to maximize shop frontage, transparency, and floor space. Now there's a new idea that almost gives the building its public spirit. And if a building has a public spirit, is well received by the community in which it sits, it will ultimately be commercially successful. That's how I see it.
Simon Allford, thank you for joining us on this Design Intelligence Global webcast. It's been a delight spending this time with you. Thank you for this.
Dave, it's an absolute pleasure to engage with you in Design Intelligence, and indeed to be sharing ideas.
Yes.
It's the future. Thanks very much.
All the best.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.